A buck 110. Folding hunter could fit in a belt sheath. The factory behind it took more than 50 tractor trailers to move. In 2003, belt grinders, ceramic tumblers, CNC equipment, and heat treatment machinery were loaded out of Buck Knives' plant in El Cajon, California, and sent roughly 1,400 miles north to Post Falls, Idaho. By that time, the knife was familiar enough to sit in a garage drawer, a hunting pack, or on a workbench beside a roll of tape and a box of screws. It had been copied so widely that many Americans used the words buck knife for almost any folding lockback. But copying the shape was simple. Copying the way Buck made the blade was not. By the early 2000s, the same pressures hollowing out American cutlery had reached Buck lower cost imports, retail price pressure, and California operating costs that made the knife impossible to keep building in the place where it had grown up. Buck survived by moving the production system before the brand became only a name. Decades before the trailers left California, the Buck name began beside a forge. In 1902, Hoyt Buck was 13 years old and working as a blacksmith's apprentice in Leavenworth, Kansas. The work in front of him was rough steel farm tools, heat, and water. Grub hose and reaping blades went dull too quickly. A tool that looked ready in the morning could lose its edge before the day was done. For a farmer, that was not a small defect. It meant stopping work, sharpening again, and losing time in the field. Hoyt started watching the steel more closely. He learned that the edge changed with heat, and heat had to be read by color. Red, orange, then a straw shade before the quench. He held the metal longer, heated it more evenly, worked the failures again, and tested the edge with whatever was nearby: a thumbnail, a rope, another job waiting on the bench. That was the beginning of Buck's advantage. Not a logo, not a factory. A way of making ordinary steel hold an edge longer than people expected. For years, that knowledge stayed small. Hoyt worked as a logger, a sawmill millwright, a pastor, and a repairman for people who could not always afford to replace what broke. The work stayed close to practical need. Sharpen a tool fix, a blade, make the next edge a little more reliable than the last. The first larger demand came during World War II, after Pearl Harbor. American servicemen needed knives. Hoyt did not have a stockroom full of finished blades. He had a forge, a church basement in Mountain Home, Idaho, and worn-out mill files that could be bought cheaply and turned back into useful steel. In 1947, after Hoyt moved south to be near his son Al Buck, became a California business in a lean-to built onto the side of a garage on Moreno Boulevard. The shop measured 10 feet by 12 feet. Raw materials still came from discarded industrial files bought for almost nothing from the aircraft work nearby. There was not much room in that shop, enough for steel, enough for grinding, enough for heat, and enough for a manufacturing method that would eventually grow far beyond the scale of a small garage. On April 18, 1963, Buck's next step was written into a board resolution. The company approved development of a new folding hunting knife. The goal was simple to understand and difficult to build. Make a knife that could fold for carrying but stay firm enough in the field that a hunter would trust it the way he trusted a fixed blade. A fixed blade had strength. A pocket knife had convenience. Buck wanted both in one tool. The mechanical answer came from Guy Huser, an engineer with a practical feel for simple devices. His design used a rocker bar lockback, a spring-loaded mechanism that held the blade open until the user pressed a release at the back of the handle. The knife could ride in a sheath or pocket, then lock open when the work began. That knife became the Buck 110 Folding Hunter. The first shipment was small. In the fourth quarter of 1964, Buck shipped 255 Model 110s. They had brass bolsters, wood handles, and enough weight to feel solid in the hand. At just over 7 ounces, the 110 was not a light pocket trinket. it felt like a tool a person expected to keep. The price made the challenge clear. A buck 110 could sell for $12 to $20, when a comparable fixed blade might sell for $5. A buyer had to believe the lock would hold, the edge would last, and the knife would still be useful after seasons of use. Buck put a lifetime warranty behind it, but the real test still happened in the object itself. If the blade loosened, if the edge failed, if the knife felt cheap in the hand, the warranty could not make the first impression again. By 1968, Buck's sales had grown 950% in 5 years. The Model 110 moved through hardware stores, sporting goods counters, hunting catalogs, and Army-Navy surplus shops. It became the kind of knife that could leave the store on a belt before hunting season, then stay for years in a garage drawer, a toolbox, or the side pocket of a truck door. As the 110 became more visible, the visible part became easier to copy. Buck had chosen not to patent the lockback design. The reasons are still debated: cost, timing, simplicity, or some mix of all three, but the result was plain. Other companies could make a folding lockback with a similar outline. They could put it on the same shelf. They could sell something that looked close enough from a few feet away. What they could not copy from the outside was the way Buck treated the steel ground. The blade checked the fit and repeated those steps across thousands of knives. The Model 110 made Buck bigger. It also moved the company into a different kind of competition. Once the shape could travel freely, the factory had to carry more of the difference. By 1980, Buck was building the kind of factory that made the Model 110 feel less like a lucky product and more like a repeatable operation. The new plant at 1900 Weld Boulevard in El Cajon covered about 200,000 square feet on 10 acres of land. At peak production, roughly 600 people worked there. The building held a machine shop, a heat treatment area. Grinding rooms handle assembly, ceramic tumbling, and quality control under one roof. A knife did not become a Buck knife in one step. Steel blanks had to be cut. Blades had to be heated, frozen tempered ground fitted, tumbled, inspected, and boxed. The brass had to meet the handle cleanly. The lock had to close with the same feel again and again. A customer might only see the finished knife in a case at a sporting goods counter, but the difference was being made in the first steps of production long before it reached the shelf. Paul Boss helped to make that difference harder to imitate. His heat treatment work gave Buck a way to pull better performance from steel that competitors could also buy. The advantage was not only the steel grade, it was the way the blade was treated after Buck had it. That mattered when the orders got larger. In 1982, Buck signed a distribution deal with Kmart. 5 years later, the United States Army awarded the company a contract to manufacture the M9 bayonet, more than 300,000 units for American soldiers. The company that had started beside a garage was now supplying mass retail shelves and military procurement at the same time. From the outside, that looked like strength. In many ways, it was. More shelves meant more customers. Larger orders meant more output. A bigger plant gave Buck the space to repeat its process at scale. But the Kmart shelf introduced a different kind of measurement. A hunting knife in a small sporting goods store could be sold through weight, reputation, feel, and a counterman who knew what he was showing. A knife in a mass retailer sat inside a colder comparison. Price, packaging, margin, shelf space. A buyer could look at two folding knives and ask why one had to cost more. For Buck, the answer was still inside the factory: heat grinding, fit inspection, and warranty support. But on a retail shelf, those things were not always visible. The same factory that made the Buck 110 worth paying more for also made it harder to compete on price alone against cheaper knives built to win the shelf first. By the 1990s, the challenge facing Buck did not come from one dramatic event. It appeared quietly in the form of another knife sitting on the same retail shelf. A folding knife made in China did not have to match a Buck 110 in every detail. It did not need the same history, the same heat treatment, or the same feel in the hand. It only had to look close enough from a few feet away, cost far less, and give a retail buyer a reason to ask why Buck's knife needed so much room in the price. That was the harder kind of competition. Buck could explain why its knives cost more. A sporting goods customer might understand the weight, the lock, the edge, the way the brass met the handle. A retailer buying in volume saw another set of numbers: first, wholesale cost margin, packaging, shelf space, and how many units could move at a lower price. The cheaper knife did not have to replace Buck overnight. It only had to make Buck defend every dollar. Inside El Cajon, that defense was expensive. The same steps that made a Buck knife feel different also made it harder to lower the cost quickly. Steel still had to be treated. Blades still had to be ground. Locks still had to fit. Finished knives still had to pass inspection before the name went out the door. In 2000, Buck opened a contract manufacturing facility in China under pressure from those same retail realities. It was not the end of American production. It was a sign that the old California cost structure could no longer answer every part of the market from one plant. C.J. Buck had become president the year before. He was not new to the floor. In 1978, he had started on the production line building Model 110 folding hunters. By the time he took over, the knife that had made the family name was now sitting in a market where cheaper copies could pull the price conversation away from the factory that made the original. The numbers began to show the damage. Buck's annual sales had fallen about 25% since 1995. The workforce that had once reached roughly 600 people had dropped to about 250. Then California added problems that had nothing to do with the shape of a knife. During the 2001 energy crisis, rolling blackouts moved through the state. For Buck, power was not only a utility bill, it was tied to heat treatment, one of the steps that separated a finished blade from a piece of steel. A blackout did not have to close the factory to matter. It showed that part of Buck's most important process depended on something outside the factory gate. Workers' compensation added another cost. California's rates ran far above Idaho's. For a plant with grinders, machines, heat assembly benches, and inspection stations, that gap followed every shift. By 2003, C.J. Buck was looking at three problems at once: cheaper knives, pulling down the shelf price, California adding cost before each blade left the plant, and a production process that could not be stripped down without changing the product. The Buck 110 had grown up in California. The market around it was starting to price that place out of the knife. In January 2003, C.J. Buck stood in front of the El Cajon workforce and told them the plant was leaving California. The announcement split the factory in two. There were machines that could travel, and there were people who often could not. No more than about 60 workers were offered relocation packages to Idaho. Roughly 190 men and women would stay behind in California. Some had spent years inside that building. Some knew the sound of a grinder before they saw the part in front of it. Some knew when a lock did not feel right before the defect became a number on a report. The factory needed that knowledge, but the move could not carry all of it north. After the announcement, El Cajon became a dismantling job. CNC machines, belt grinders, ceramic tumblers, and heat treatment equipment were taken apart, palletized, and loaded onto more than 50 tractor trailers. The route ran roughly 1,400 miles out of Southern California and into the Idaho Panhandle. Buck was not moving office furniture. It was moving the parts of production that still made a Buck knife different from the cheaper knives pulling down the shelf price. In Post Falls, the new plant gave the company a lower cost base. Idaho offered training support. The land was cheaper. Annual savings were measured at more than $1 million. The move kept Buck alive, but it did not make survival easy. In 2009, C.J. Buck stood in front of the Post Falls workforce and announced a 10% pay cut, including his own. The factory had moved. The pressure had not disappeared. It had only changed shape. Schrade was Buck's warning from inside the same industry. In Ellenville, New York, the old knife maker behind names like Old Timer and Uncle Henry faced many of the same pressures. In 2004, workers received a one-page letter telling them their last day had arrived. The names still had value. They could be sold owned and put back on shelves. But the factory that had made those names mean something did not continue with them. Buck was trying to avoid that split. The price was written across two places, a new plant in Idaho and an old one in California that no longer held the knife it helped build. In Post Falls, Idaho, Buck Knives still operates from the factory it built after leaving California. The building is not the old El Cajon plant. It is smaller. It belongs to a different city, a different cost structure, and a different chapter of the company. But the work is still there. Steel still moves through machines. Blades are still heated, ground-fitted, finished, and inspected before they leave the building. That is what Buck managed to keep. Not the old California footprint. Not every worker who once stood inside it. Not the scale of the peak years when hundreds of people worked under one roof in El Cajon. What survived was the connection between the name and the work behind the name. A Buck knife could have followed the path taken by many old American cutlery names. The factory closes, the trademark is sold, the product returns to the shelf from somewhere else, and the old building becomes a separate memory. Buck came close enough to see that outcome. It chose a harder route. The company moved the machines. It rebuilt the line. It accepted a smaller, more expensive version of survival than a clean brand sale would have offered. A Buck 110 can still fit inside a belt sheath. The factory behind it no longer sits in the place where the knife grew up. But in Post Falls, a blade still passes through heat grinding, fitting, and inspection before the name leaves the plant. The Buck mark still leaves the factory on steel.